All right, with that, let me say good day, everyone, and welcome to this webinar organized by UXPA International, the first of 2025. My name is EJ Makala, and I will be your host. Today's program is a special one. We are joined by two guests who, since the year 2000, have been helping to conduct and analyze UXPA's biannual salary survey. The two guests are Jeff Suaro. Jeff is the founder and CEO of Measuring U. He is a Six Sigma trained statistical analyst and a pioneer in quantifying the user experience. Jim Lewis is a distinguished UX researcher at Measuring U, and he holds a PhD in experimental psychology and a MA in engineering psychology. And before I turn it over to them, just a couple of words. As many of you know, the UXPA strives to bring high quality content that is relevant to the UX community, including the one that you're seeing today. Towards the end of this session, which is expected to last for an hour or so, I will provide information about how you can submit ideas for future topics. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube in the coming days. Also, the slide deck that Jeff and Jim will be showing you is also available on the UXPA website, and I will post links to that in the comments during the event itself. So with that, let me turn things over to Jeff and Jim for today's presentation.
Awesome, thanks, EJ. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with the presentation. So this is a report you can mostly follow along on from the slides on the UXPA website. And it's a pretty dense report. It's a good reference material. So as EJ said, we've been working, sort of volunteering to do this report for a couple decades now. And this is the first time, though, we've actually presented it. So we're happy to talk about the work that goes into it and the sort of the changes over time and what we've been able to derive from the data. So let's get into it. You got our introductions. Again, Jeff, I'm Jeff Suaro, and then Jim Lewis and I both work at Measuring U. We're based in Denver. We do both software, our MUIQ platform, which we used to deliver the UXPA survey. And we also do services and training as well. So let's get into it. This was the survey that was conducted last year. So we're talking about 2024 data just a few months ago. You can see sort of what is started earlier in the year, about 12 minutes long. The methodology of the survey is, as it always been, it's a convenience sample. So we're inviting folks through our professional networks, UXPA's email lists, and so forth. And then there's a series of snowballs. We're asking other people, if you know people in the industry, to answer that. So keep that in mind. It's not necessarily following any sort of strict protocol on quota sampling, but as we'll see throughout, we have other data sources that allow us to corroborate some of those particular findings. But in particular, it's the same methodology that's been used for decades. So the historical comparisons have been quite meaningful, given that the methodology has largely stayed the same, including some of the same questions that have been put together, some that have been there for 20 some odd years. So UXPA comes up with the questions. We just collect the data and do the analysis. We advise on some of the wording and so forth, but who comes up with the questions is the UXPA organization. And where possible, we try and keep those questions as similar as we can. Some things have just changed over time, but we try and keep the similarity so we can make those comparisons. And that's what we're going to get started with, just the composition of the panel. Composition of the sample in this particular case. And you can see the historical data starting with the 2024 that we just completed here. As is always the case, the bulk of the respondents are coming from the US and the UK. And you can see how that's changed a little bit over time. But keep that in mind as we talk about generalizing these findings. It's again, largely US based, but then a long tail of other countries as well in Europe and Asia. There's those list of those countries, and this is the 2024 sample there. As is typically the case, there's also a breakdown about regions. You can see where we are in 2024, where people come from. Largely similar. There's some changes that we've seen over time for the last 10 years about where the respondents come from. Typically, these match the job. So you can see Northern California had a little bit more, but we still see quite a few folks from California in the sample. See a few more folks in the Southeast than I think we had from some earlier past. So reflecting both a combination of geographic changes as well as just changes in the sample composition of things go on. If you guys have questions as we go along, though, feel free to put it in the Q&A and or chat, and then Jim is going to answer. We'll also talk about some of these, and EJ might jump in a little bit with some of these particular questions. Again, there's a lot of detail. We're not going to be able to go at all of it, but we're just going to give you an overview of the things that you can expect to see in the deck and give you some thoughts about why we went about certain analyses, and as well as a couple extracurricular analyses that we did outside the report that we'll talk about. Again, here's the geographic distribution of the bulk of the sample coming from the US. So you can see where some of the states are. So, or where the respondents are per state. More of a concentration depending on where the particular companies are. But with a lot of folks still working remotely, you can see if people all across the US. I'm in Colorado and Jim is in Florida. So we're across the US as well. So here's the distribution of the age, pretty similar over the years. Again, throughout these slides, the most recent years could be on the far left, and the oldest one's on the far right. So you can see bulk respondents are going to be between this 26 and 45, fluctuating a little bit, but not too much over the years. A little bit of note about our sample size. You can see back 2014, 2016, we had a relatively large sample size that's gotten a little smaller over the years. Why is that? We think it's a combination of things. UXPA is not the only ones doing salary surveys. I think they were one of the first to do that for decades. And it became one of the only sources. As time has gone on, I think there's been a few of those. And so I think you get some folks who think, oh, I already responded to this particular survey, even though it's different. So there could be a little bit of survey fatigue in there as well. And it potentially changes in membership and distribution channels over time as well as how that's gone. But still a large enough sample for us to draw statistically significant conclusions for several variables, as you'll see throughout. Gender breakdown, pretty similar years over years, slightly more women than men over time. You could see that pretty consistent as well. One of the key variables we're looking at is people's education, which ends up being a significant predictor of salary. And you'll see it's interesting, more than half of the respondents, and pretty consistently since we've been measuring, and certainly since we're displaying the data here, more than half have an advanced degree, so a master's or PhD or PsyD or some terminal degree there as well. Very few have less than a bachelor's. And again, that's been pretty consistent since we've been taking measurements. And then years of experience, a little bit more of a uniform distribution. You have a little bit smaller group of people who are newer to the field. So the bulk of people who are responding are definitely the 3+ years folks in the sample there. Again, you can kind of see all that. Again, respondent prior experience has a significant impact on salary, as we'll also talk about there. So this ends up being important. It ends up being somewhat linear. Generally, the more years of experience you have, that you can increase your salary as well there. Job title, who's made up in this particular sample? I think this is important. Are we talking managers? As you can see here, the bulk are going to be people who are saying user researcher or designer where their particular job. But you do see we do have a good distribution of other titles, as well as supervisor roles, managers, and so forth in there as well. So that's who's making up the sample when we talk about the data. If you say, is that similar to me or not similar to me? This is one of the key things to look at, distribution of job title there as well. And another significant predictor of salary is going to be, in addition to education and experience, is going to be your job level. So are you an individual contributor or are you in a supervisor level? And so you can see this is a designation, again, it's been around for quite a while. It's try to keep it similar. Some organizations use slightly different terminology, but it's has enough levels of distinction. So you could say, here's your supervisors and here's your non-supervisors. And you've essentially got entry level, and you've got mid-level, and then you've got non-supervisory senior level folks here. So a slight bump higher this year in the senior level non-supervisory than we have in the past.
Hey, Jeff, may I interrupt and ask a question?
Sure, Jay.
Yeah, so one thing that stands out to me a little bit is that the senior level non-supervisory segment there is greater than senior level supervisory. that might be counterintuitive to some people. Do you have any reasoning behind that?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, so the first thing, it's relatively consistent, a little bit higher bump here than in the past, but those numbers aren't too different. I think that just speaks to, as you get more people in the field having more experience, you're going to have more senior level people, and there's potentially more of a, I guess, a limit on the number of roles for managing. It's interesting. The senior level
Yeah.
supervisory, more consistent. Jim, you have some thoughts?
Well, yeah, just that the managers have a certain number, like you're saying, certain number of people they manage, and there are some people who achieve a senior level and have either managed in the past and found it wasn't their taste, or early on realized that management simply wasn't their forte and prefer to do the individual contribution.
Yeah.
And again, like you said, there are more slots for people like that than there are for managers. So I think that the numbers are plausible.
Yeah. Sounds good. Company size, another main contributor to salary, one of the strongest predictors. So the biggest one is going to be where you live, really the country and the state you live in if you live in the US. And then one of the second biggest ones is going to be the size of the company. You can see the sample, 40% of the sample is coming from the largest organization. So these are the FANG type companies, the large multinational companies there when you're employing 10,000 plus folks there. So 40% come from there. And then you've got this distribution for smaller companies. I mean, there's some interesting speculation about why, but you're largely in a situation where as a product organization gets larger, there's a need for dedicated, more specialization, dedicated designers. Then as you get enough designers, you need dedicated researchers. I think when we've done this analysis in the past, we typically see something like 7 to 10, for every 7 to 10 designers, you have one dedicated researcher. And so as these orgs get bigger, you've got to be quite large, have a lot of products. And that's why you'll see quite a few of the respondents in the sample coming from the larger companies as well. So kind of interesting. Keep that in mind as we look at some of the salary data. So now,
And
that's
Jeff,
the composition.
sorry,
Yeah, Jim.
another question from the Q&A about the composition. Is it common that more researchers respond to surveys than designers and other professionals? So in other words, is our larger number of researchers in that chart simply due because researchers love surveys, and so they take them and everybody else says, hey, don't waste my time? I don't know that we can
That's
really,
a good question.
it's a good question. I don't know that we can answer it. Do you remember what the patterns have been like in previous surveys?
I don't. And I think that's a good question. We do have, if you go to our website, we do have a distribution of job titles over the years. So that's something that, I mean, we might be able to look at later. But yeah, good question. Don't know the answer. But if you are looking at comparing salary sources or data that you see today, it may be an important variable to look at as to what's the composition of certainly job titles and other ones, and certainly let us know if you see a vast difference there. Because you're right, it is heavily user research based. So yeah, good. I think it's a good open question. I don't think we have a great answer. Okay, to the salary data. So we start with the kind of interesting stuff. So as is the case with salary data, just like home sales data, when you're talking about dollars or any kind of currency, and there's no upward bound, you're going to get this long, large tail. So you can imagine CEOs of a lot of these companies, the executive levels, a lot of these companies are going to make an order of magnitude higher than some of the entry level employees in there. And so what ends up happening is your average salary is heavily distorted by a handful of very high salaries. And so as is common in the industry, you can use the median as opposed to the regular mean when describing the middle. And that's what we're going to do throughout, is we're going to be using the median salary. So that helps offset. So that's by definition, half the sample is above this point and half the sample is below. So that's, I think, the number one point as you're looking at this data is we're using the median to offset. Otherwise, the mean will be higher, pulled up by a handful of very large salaries. Number two, throughout, you're going to see these little black whiskers. These aren't, don't rub your monitor. That's not a smudge on your screen. These are an indication of sampling error. These are 95% confidence intervals throughout. And this is our best estimate, is if we were to increase the sample size or in some way measure everybody that's in the field. Our best estimate is the median salary would fall within this range here. And what's great about these confidence intervals is that you can use these not only to see how much fluctuation you could expect, if we were to say double, triple, or measure everybody, but you can then do a quick comparison, a visual comparison between years. And when there is no overlap between years, you can conclude the differences are statistically significant. So there's a couple things to keep in mind here too. So what that means is the lower bound of this interval, you can see dips to about 110, which is higher than the upper bound of the 2018 and 2016 and 2014 data. So now if on one hand, that makes us think, great, we're all getting paid more. That's great. There's been a clear increase. However, when we're dealing with currencies, the next issue, as many of you, if you've been alive for the last few years, know that inflation takes a toll out of salaries. And so first, what you're looking at here is non-inflation adjusted salaries. What you could buy in 2014 with $1 or $92,000 is more than you could buy with the same amount in 2024. So how do we account for that? Well, you can use something called inflation adjusted salaries, where we look at what the CPI was and essentially deflates the value of each of those. And we can have more apples to apples comparison years over years. Now, note in some of our slides, you'll see we do have constant dollars. In other cases, we don't. So anytime we're looking for historical data, ideally we're looking at constant dollars. And if not, take that with a grain of salt when you're looking at it, because it's not always that easy to do. So for example, the next slide, we went ahead and did that. So what would happen if we were to take into account inflation, that average of 120,000, that looked good, much higher, you can see is nominally lower than it was in 2022 and statistically lower than it was in 2016. So these are all using constant $2,024 that, Jim, you pulled up from August of 2024, right?
Yeah, this might be a good time to talk about those confidence interval bounds.
Yeah.
So
now, like we did before, we can see the upper bound of our median salary is 120K. The upper bound of that, you can see, is still below the 2016 data. So that's why I'm able to say, yeah, it's statistically lower. There was a sort of a peak time. It was a great time to be in the field in 2016. And since then, it's been pretty consistent, the pay, and even in 2014. So there was a sort of a bump. Was it the difference in the sample potentially, or was there something else going on to sort of the pay generally higher, and then the sort of the field catches up to it?
Yeah, that's the thing about one of my favorite sayings about statistics. It's the world's most exact way of saying maybe. So,
exactly.
But from 2022 to 2024, even though we see a nominal drop of a couple of $1,000s, that's well within the margin of error.
Well within the margin of error, yeah. And so keep that in mind as we look at it. It's going to be tempting as we look at each one of these. There's going to be natural ups and downs, ups and downs. And to avoid being fooled by randomness, we want to look at those error bars as confidence intervals to say, all right, is this beyond what we would expect just from the sampling error, just from the people who happen to sample, the number of people, especially from year over year. And so that's an important way to keep things in mind as we're making those particular comparisons there. The second thing to keep in mind is you'll look at this salary of 120K. Oh, I make less than that. Should I be making it? I feel like I'm at least an average employee. Shouldn't I be making that? Keep in mind that this is heavily influenced, as we're going to talk about next, by a number of factors. The strongest is going to be geography, as we're going to see. People who live in the US tend to make substantially more than people who live in Europe or Asia. And then people who live in California tend to make substantially more than people who live in the US. So before you pack your bags and move to California, though, keep in mind, obviously, a lot of that additional increase is eaten up by the cost of living that you see in California there. So this accounts for geography, and then that accounts for senior level people with 20 plus years of experience, as well as entry level people. So as we'll talk about next, one of the best ways to understand, am I being paid fairly, or what should I ask for? It's very similar to assessing the value of a home, assessing the value of a car. Not all cars are the same. Not all homes are the same. There are a number of important variables that predict how much you should be paying: location for homes, mileage on cars, and so forth. And when it comes to salary, it's going to be location, years of experience, size of the company are the biggest predictors, and then your level, if you're a senior level or if you're a supervisor or not. So let's dig into this a little bit more. We'll see what we're talking about here. So now when we break this down by years of experience, this is where our first warning comes into play. We did not we'd have so many slides in here. So we just did the nominal, and maybe nominally non-inflation adjusted values are higher here. But you can see year over year, we see the same consistent pattern. More time in the field generally leads to more years of experience. And so you would be comparing those year over year. Again, non-inflation adjusted. So why is everybody getting paid more this year than years past? Because inflation was so much higher. Median salary by gender. This, we often get asked questions about this one, and this tends to bounce around every year. A lot of people kind of look into this a little bit, but again, the confidence interval. So this year in 2024, men in aggregate were making nominally more than women reported here. But again, you see the large overlap in the confidence intervals, not statistically significant. You can see in years past, sometimes it's, I mean, in 2022 it was exactly the same. Other times it's fluctuated a little bit there, and you can see the sample sizes as well. There's the what's called the interquartile range as well. So when you're looking at a non-normal distribution, you've got this long tail. A confidence interval around the median is one way to look at it, but you can also say, well, where's the bulk of the data falling in? And this is the quartile is the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile of the data. So half the sample would fall within the first and the third quartile there. And so you can kind of see how the distribution differs for each of them.
And again, you know, don't have confidence intervals around this, but it's interesting that in the first quartile, male salaries tend to, you know, are showing up as lower than female. It's in the third quartile that there's a switch. And then the second quartile is the, well, that's the median.
Yeah, and this is, yeah, the second quartile is the median. Right, so here you could say, oh, look, entry level, or sorry, the first quartile of men are making less than women. So it's an interesting, there's a more dispersed, a wider distribution of salaries for men than there are women here. But again, the reason why we have to be careful is looking at one variable at a time is because the interaction effect of other things, experience and geography, end up washing out these nominal differences that we end up seeing. So for example, here's the first place. If we were just to break down salary by gender and years of experience, so a two variable analysis, you could see actually nominally, as women are actually making a lot more nominally than men are within 0 to 2 years of experience. But these error bars are telling us don't draw these strong conclusions just from these fluctuations. This is largely due to sampling error there. Same thing now when we look at, or not the same thing, but now we see a different difference. When you look at years of experience, there's this large gap between 16 and 20 years. Not the hugest sample sizes here, but we're sort of verging on statistical difference here. You could see, for whatever reason, women in this particular category are making $80,000 more than men are at this level of experience. Again, we don't read it too much into it because when Jim and I take into account a multivariate analysis, is let's predict salary, let's use gender, let's use years of experience, let's use location, let's come up with all sorts of, gender ends up falling out as not a statistic for predictor, meaning other variables are actually accounting for the differences. And those are almost always location, years, and then the job level and so forth. Big ones, again, median salary by country. And you can see this throughout. Again, this is the largest effect that we see, and it's been consistent throughout. US-based professionals make substantially and statistically more than their counterparts in Europe here. So you can see in many cases almost 2x the amount. So that's again the median. So you can see those are statistically different. And then even within the region, California coasts typically make nominally more, and that's why, again, this becomes an important predictor. Not inflation adjusted there, but we can kind of see at least over time. And then as you get more experience, what we're doing is we're comparing at least 2024 data to 2022, how much things have particularly changed. But this gives you an idea of, all right, if you're entry level, if you're coming into the field, this is a better predictor of what your salary should be. The average salary, the median salary is about 82K for everybody in the field, and no matter where you are. Of course, knowing that you're in California versus in the UK is going to play a big role in terms of what's considered sort of a fair or typical salary as well. Same thing with educational level. More years, more time in the academy, the more particular money that gets associated as well with that degree there. So you can see The higher the degree, the higher the pay, master's degree, doctorate degree. The last few decades, Jim and I have talked and mentored and answered questions about, should I be getting an advanced degree? Because look, this data suggests you're definitely getting paid more. So is it financially worth it for people, for example, who are considering, I'm in bachelor's degree, or I'm going to take time and I'm going to go get a master's and a PhD to get more pay? It's an interesting question, and it's a question that we've analyzed. And there's some variables to look at here. So this is one of the few slides that's sort of extracurricular. We have a analysis where we've gone back into some of the historical data, as well as dug into this data a little bit more for sort of a more lengthier analysis. And it's basically, does an advanced degree pay off purely financially? Now, the intrinsic value one gets from the education of an advanced degree is certainly very valuable. But if you're purely thinking about doing it for monetary reasons only, what our analysis has found is if you stop working or you do not enter the workforce and you delay entry, while you are getting paid more for masters and PhDs, the loss of 2 years for, say, a typical master's program and the loss of 5 years for a typical PhD, you're losing 70, 80, 90K, 100K per year, depending on where you're starting and where you're living. How long would it take for you to make up for not being in the workforce? For a master's, what you can see here is there's your no grad degree, and this is your lifetime earnings that goes up to a little over $3 million for no grad degree. And you can see it's definitely higher lifetime earnings at 35 years. So you could see the break-even point for a master's is right around here, right, Jim? 24th year?
For the master, yeah, 24th year.
So it takes about 24 years to break
there.
even for losing 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah. The 24th year, which means after 19 years of working. Because not everybody starts working at this, we've got everything centered on the first year of work for those without degrees.
And even longer for a PhD. So,
yeah.
And may I ask a question too, Jeff? Is this, does this take into account things like tuition or other expenses involved in actually getting that sort of degree?
Great question. It does not at all. This assumes a free master's and a free PhD. Now, there is a world in where that can happen, but it's not in most people's world. So that compounds things even more when making that calculation.
Yeah. Increases what you would call the opportunity cost.
Yeah, increases the
because
opportunity.
Not only are you losing salary, you're incurring additional expense.
That's right. So you're incurring additional expense. Most master's programs are going to require at least some pay. Several PhD programs will either be subsidized, some can be free depending on the particular program. So that can certainly help. So we've essentially, this is really kind of a best case scenario here. Now, before you say, okay, why even do this? What's the point of doing this? Now, there is a sort of way to hack this system, if you will, and you're looking at two people who've sort of done that. Is there's clearly a value in having an advanced degree. Most people in the field have it. How do you offset these particular things? It's, well, you pursue your master's while still working. You pursue your PhD while still working. Both Jim and I have done that over the last 20 to 40 years. It's not the easiest thing. You have to juggle a lot more, but it certainly is doable. And you get the best of both worlds there. You do not lose. And it certainly can lead to more opportunities. Now, what this analysis doesn't look at, it's only the nominal differences in pay based upon the models that we've looked at here. Does having a master's or a PhD help you get a job, help you get a promotion over other people? Potentially, we don't have data that necessarily suggests otherwise. It certainly seems like it would, but we don't have that. But if the answer is purely, should I do this for the money? It suggests if you're going to leave the workforce, it's not going to pay off just for the money. So don't do it just for the money. Okay, company size. Again, bulk of the sample is coming from large companies, 5,000 plus, 10,000 plus, especially there. Larger companies can pay larger salaries. They're bringing in the big bucks and they're paying the big bucks. That's basically what you see here. They're just the scale and the size of large organizations are able to offer much higher pay. So if you want to increase your pay, certainly going from a smaller company to a larger company is doing that, especially if you can avoid being in a more expensive geography. Respondents who reported, so here's again by job title. We just sorted this by highest to lowest there. Not too surprisingly, managers make higher. Some of these sample sizes are really small, and you can see the really wide error bars in here. So even though these are sorted, there's not a lot of data in some of these to draw strong conclusions. So you've got managers in here, but then you've got user researcher, then you've got design operations, and so forth. Something that's a good reference point for those looking at that. Again, here's a good distribution. There's the 25th to 75th or interquartile range here of salaries by the particular department or the particular title. What about certification? So we're talking about what can we do to increase pay? So one thing, if you can move to California, you can increase pay. Another thing, a large company as well. Another thing, what about certification? This has come up over the years. And so we've asked folks in the survey, do you hold a certificate or not? And you can see 34% of people do hold a certificate. So 66% they said they didn't. But you can see, therefore, that breaks up to about 34%, and where that falls, the most common being an academic course or the Nielsen-Norman group there. So people who hold a certificate, again, nominally 122K versus 118, 9K make higher. Oh, is certificates therefore pay off? Well, if you've been paying attention for the last few minutes, the first thing you'll notice is there's very large overlap in the error bars. So these are not statistically different. One thing we wanted to dig into, though, was, well, what else is going on? Is there an impact of time with the certificate as well? So then as you have the certificate, does it maybe pay off after several years? So we looked into that and we found no, right, Jim? Anything else you want to add about that?
Yeah, there just isn't much of a pattern there that isn't already explained by just experience as a UX professional in the workforce.
There you go.
And it's people get their certifications at different times, and we'll talk more about some of the non-financial aspects of certification a little bit later.
Yeah. So we've talked about multiple variables here, and what we've done, this is outside of the report. In order to provide all the combinations of how each thing's played together statistically, it would require too large of a report and too much time. So instead, we just host, as we have for decades, a salary calculator on our website. This year's a little different than years past. What we've done is we've combined the UXPA data with another external source from user interviews who made their data publicly available. There were a number of variables that lined up that they asked. Again, a completely different organization, the UXPA. We combined those where we could. So they did not ask educational level, whereas UXPA did. So that's, even though that's a statistically significant predictor, but we're not able to include that in the calculator. But these variables together, country, years of experience, employment level, and then region, and then the size of the company, just those variables together explain about 70% of the variability, right? 60, 70%, 67%, Jim, with the R squared was there?
Yeah. Somewhere around there. I'll go check on that exact number.
Check that. So these combinations are the best predictor. And if you want to predict your salary, just like saying how much is my car worth, how much is my house worth, you need a few variables. These are the ones that stood out as being statistically significant, pretty consistent over time. So I have that. You have this on our website. At any point in there, there's two things. One, it's predicting your salary using a multivariate regression model. That's the predicted salary. The second thing it's doing is it's filtering through the data to say how many people match those exact criteria that you put in there. And this will update real time. So for example, if I say, well, okay, as we've seen, the median salary for everybody was 120 in the UXPA sample. Interestingly enough, it's about the same when we combined user interviews data with the UXPA. So that's why when we talked about earlier, the sample size being a little bit smaller, the convenience sample, the snowball sampling, you definitely need to be careful about the generalizability of that. How you're careful is you say, how well does it corroborate with an largely independent data source? And the answer is for a lot of these variables pretty similar. You can see overall, the median salaries are about the same, which was great. So there are combined 1,000 people, 1,063 people in the data source, and it's saying your predicted salary, knowing nothing else about you, but if in your field, is going to be somewhere between 113 and 129K. As soon as you select an option, it's automatically going to filter down how many people necessarily fit within that particular that grouping there. So for example, how many people in the United States with 1 year experience? The sample had 30 people. All other things being equal, your prediction is 122. Well, why so high? Because it doesn't know where you live. So as soon as I predict, say, Mountain West, things are going to be changing there. So you can play around with play around with the salary and the confidence intervals there as you get time. And if you have questions,
Yeah.
shoot that to Jim or Ryan.
Yeah, the adjusted R squared was 72%.
72%. Great.
So yeah, those variables account for 72% of the variation in salary.
Cool. So yeah, often we'll see a common mistake people make is look at either just one variable or just look at the average. Take into account many variables as you can. It's going to provide a more accurate estimate there. So in the remaining time we've got, there was some additional analyses. So we'll sort of talk through this as time permits.
Yeah,
And
quick question, Jeff. The salaries here. I believe we just asked people what their annual salary was. We didn't ask them about bonuses, did we?
we did not ask about bonuses.
That's variable. You know, I mean, the bonus is nice, and I guess some places it's more secure than others,
right.
but it's so variable.
So what I've got, and so I've got this up in anticipation. We have to get like what the exact questions are. Again, we've tried to be somewhat consistent for the past 20 some odd years. And so this was an MUIQ. What is your annual salary? That is your gross income before taxes. That was the question that was asked.
Okay, so people may or may not have included it, probably depending upon how secure they felt about whether it was something that was going to happen.
Yeah, and
But
we realize it's murky. We don't have things like stock options in there. We don't have bonuses, profit sharing. There's a number of ways that you can get compensated. This has been the question that's been about the same again for as many years to keep it consistent, and is similar again to what's at the separate user interviews data. But good question there. Here's all the question wording. So if you guys have questions about that, we can jump over to that too. So we mentioned certifications. I did just a little bit of a deep dive. This year, the survey was a little bit longer, which probably increased a little bit of the dropout there, but we were able to ask additional questions we're going to dig into a little bit here. One question about certification. So even though we didn't see a statistical difference on pay because of certifications, we did ask people, did it help you in other ways? And you can see at least self-reported, about a quarter of people felt like it helped them get a job in the field, get a new job, 18%, a promotion, and certainly almost most people think that improved their current jobs. You could see people, it's not showing up in the actual data and the actual values, and then people don't necessarily think most people don't think it had an impact on my pay. A small amount helped it increase it. So at least when it comes to certification, it suggests that it may help with getting a job or getting a promotion. There's an additional analysis on our site where we went into that. That looks like that's probably the best benefit of certifications, obviously in addition to what you're going to learn. Just quick, we were asked about how many hours they work. And then it's kind of an interesting one. What's the vacation distribution across organizations there? How many vacation days do people get paid? Again, that doesn't show up necessarily in the pay, but it does show up here. A lot of this is going to be confounded with tenure. Typically, people with more years of experience are going to get more vacation days, but you can see about 18% have unlimited vacation. We do that at Measuring You. So most people, 80% of organizations, I guess, don't have unlimited vacation. So we look back at 24. As we've talked about, we'll talk about again, it's not necessarily the easiest year. Last couple of years, it's certainly been challenging in the industry. We asked people, did your pay change? So 72% did increase. That would at least suggest the data that we saw between 2022 and 2024 nominally going up is reflected here, that it did increase at least over that 2-year period there. A lot of that was eaten up by inflation, unfortunately. 23 stayed the same. People are asked about their compensation. Most feel they're either fairly compensated. A couple percentages for feeling a little overpaid. More feeling underpaid there.
Yeah.
A new set of questions.
It's interesting, you know, that it is an anonymous survey, so maybe people are being a little more honest about the extent to which they feel they're fairly compensated. I remember, you know, at IBM when they would do the employee survey every year, you'd have to be out of your mind to say that you were fairly compensated, but then they knew who you were.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Pay transparency. This was a new set of questions that UXPA asked this year. Pay transparency it's asking about the pay for jobs, what's displayed in your organization. So this has been a trend in the last several years. Many states now require it. We live in Colorado. They require all jobs to have a posted salary range. I believe California has started doing this as well. A number of organizations do it anyway. So pay transparency, how much is this sort of help? What percentage of people are even seeing this? So you can see the bulk are for new job postings, not necessarily anybody in my company. Half the people didn't have any of that. So there was a question that was asked is how satisfied are you with pay transparency and fairness? So a new question. And so you can see satisfaction with pay transparency, satisfaction that compensation decisions are fair. Now, without historical data, without any sort of external benchmark, one needs to be careful in interpreting this data, but Jim and I have looked at enough 11-point scale, so 0 to 10, over the years to know that generally good scores are going to be in the 80% up or so up
Yeah.
here.
Usually closer to, 7 or 8 on average.
7 or 8 would be
at least
people
over
feel,
6.
yeah.
So that's not especially encouraging.
It's not especially encouraging when you're not even at the nominal midpoint. So we'd say these are particularly low. So people are generally not feeling satisfied with the transparency and not feeling satisfied that the compensation decisions are fair. One little extracurricular thing we just did recently is we want to know is, well, what about
By
people?
recently, last night.
Recently, last night, we just decided on this. What about people who say that there is some level of transparency? Are they any more satisfied? And so Jim was able to do that quick breakout there. And as one would expect, at least hope, it does seem to have some impact on people's attitude. So as you can see here, when you broke down the sample, was it roughly half there, Jim?
Roughly, yeah.
Because I guess you had 51 to 49, I guess, right?
Yes, but it turns out that fewer than 400
people.
For some reason, the total sample didn't answer those satisfaction questions. I think that may have had to do with some of the branching in the survey about who was offered that.
Got it.
But when splitting, splitting it up like this, then there is clearly a strong effect of whether you had some level of transparency, reported having some level of it, versus those who said they had no transparency.
Right. So what this shows is they are statistically higher. You can see the 95% confidence intervals there. So statistically higher, but even those who have some transparency, and again, this is from complete full transparency, which is the minority, just some key positions or new postings. Still, most people are just not very satisfied. These are really low scores.
A question for you, Jeff. So I'm curious if the survey defined for the participants the definition of transparency. Like, I'm not sure if there are any particular boundaries about this. For example, does transparency generally mean that everyone is going to know each other's salaries? Or is it a little more constrained than that and says, like, well, we pay people in this range and that, for this particular role? Yeah. Or maybe it's even limited to just like, you get to know the pay transparency for people who hold your job.
Here, all good questions. Some can be answered. All that was asked in the survey is which of the following is true about pay transfer of your employer. And so you could see people could pick any one of these. And then how satisfied are you with the level of transparency? So all we know is their answer to this particular question. So there is a lot of variability in there, and this is probably worthy of its own sort of separate study and analysis of like, are the ranges helpful, or is it meaningful, and so forth. But yeah, good question. But that answers what exactly was presented with participants there. Also asked, and a sort of a hot topic is sort of key job events that happen. So you can see half the people said they got paid. 37% of the companies of people's organizations had layoffs. To people at the team, a third people's teams were laid off. About 10% of actual respondents themselves were laid off. So it's been certainly a rough year, rough couple years. We're going to talk about that here shortly. How long did it take to get promoted? This is kind of an interesting one. What are your expectations? Less than a year, not very often. The bulk is 1 to 2 years before you're going to get a promotion, if people got a promotion. So of the 18%, this is the distribution of promotion. So What about 2025? This was also something that parts of this was asked for the first time in this survey about those who were in a position to to hire. Do they plan to hire, and how many hires? And so you can see the distribution here. So 72% plan to make at least 2 hires, or 1 or 2 hires in 2025. That's encouraging. It sounds encouraging. We don't have any historical data on that, but it does suggest that there's still hiring activities going on. Here are the top skills people plan to hire. These are research interviews, usability testing, and so forth. We've got a comparison of what hiring managers report wanted. So again, the same people who said they're in a position to hire in the survey were asked what skills are important. We've also matched that up with like what people who responded, all people, what are they doing? And you can see the top 3 certainly line up pretty well. And then there's some shuffling around in there. So there's pretty good alignment about what people are doing, what they're hiring there. Low tech on the end there, things like eye tracking around the bottom. Also, something we're going to touch about this a little bit more, but what do people see in terms of the business climate? So first we asked about potential for hire. One question that has been asked for 15 years, at least 15 years, I believe, was people's perception of the business climate. It's changed a little bit who's been asked that. So in the previous year, you could see 35% of people added staff, 35% of people lost staff. About 25% stayed the same. And then people are also asked, are things going to improve? Are things declining? Again, answering a question when you see something like this is like, well, you can interpret this based on the distribution, but it's hard without an external context or historical data. One of the reasons why we encourage UXPA to keep the wording the same is so we can make those historical comparisons, especially in a time like we have the past couple of years. To get some idea about what's going to happen, we said, okay, let's look at that same question about people reporting that their organization added jobs and lost jobs. And we created this net jobs added percent. So here's that 2024. The same percentage in the survey said the organization added jobs as lost jobs in 24. You could see how that's fluctuated over the years. And we go all the way back. So it's usually quite high. There's usually a net positive increase. At least this could go negative, but at least it wasn't negative, it was even. So this goes all the way back to 2009. And you can see that was the last time things were about as bad as they were in 2024 when things were just slightly more positive. Now, 2009, for those of you who have been in the field, just happens, or if you recall, was just after a pretty substantial financial crisis in the US and globally, where there's a lot of contraction, a significant reduction in force across a lot of organizations. So not too surprisingly that we saw things lower. We don't have data that goes back to the .com, but this is one of the first areas where things were pretty bad. What's somewhat encouraging if the past is any indicator of what's going to happen is you could see within 2 years, we saw the largest net job growth on record, at least in terms of what was reported in the survey that happened within 2 years. So our hope certainly for the industry is that we see something similar happen in 25 and 26, is that things more than rebound in terms of net growth there as well. Some just additional questions that were asked about the maturity of an organization. You can take a look at that if you're interested. Skill acquisition. New stuff that was asked as well was AI, hot topic. Is it going to take jobs? Do you use it? First time these were asked, we'll see how this changes. We'll ask it again probably in 26. Impact of AI on your role in the last year. Company encouraged it, tried to apply some, found some value, no impact. How's it going to impact your role? What about on the profession? Is it going to take jobs? About 30% of people think it will cause US job losses. Some people think it's going to degrade the user experience. So some pessimistic views there. We'll see how those changes over time when the hype cycle calms down a little bit with respect to AI as well.
Jeff, I'm also curious if you have any, lack of better phrase, any hot takes on this. Like, this is something that I think is interesting because we're going to be able to track it over time to see what really occurs. But do you have any, like, did any of this information either surprise you, or does it seem consistent with, your general sense of, what's in the ether?
Yeah. Good question. I think so. Jim and I have done our own analyses on AI. We did some early in 23. We did some last year as well. It's certainly changing a lot. We're seeing it certainly play a role here at Measuring You. And I think our hot take on it is right now we don't see evidence necessarily that AI is going to cost you your job. However, we do see it as a skill that if you don't understand how to use it and extend your skills, it likely will leave you behind. No different than a lot of technologies that come out. You really need to be. We encourage you to understand what can and can't be done. For example, the ability to AI to summarize comments and notes and transcripts is quite remarkable. It's just not something that could be done a couple of years ago. But that's just not something. There's still a level of synthesis that needs to happen there, even with summaries and understanding what was missed and what's not missed. So it ends up being a tool to enhance the researcher. So if you're not able to use that tool, that may lead you falling behind. So it's a skill gap as opposed to, robots are going to take all our jobs and we're all going to be going home. I don't think there's that necessarily that gloom and doom there, but I think it's going to lead to enhanced productivity. It's going to lead to a sort of faster cycle between data collection and insights. And certainly we're looking at how to incorporate a lot of that in our MUIQ platform as well, how we do that for both moderated and unmoderated testing. But yeah, good question. And I think that's the end of the data that was in the report. Again, there's a lot in there for you to go back and look at. You can use the salary calculator, and there's those additional analyses on the site if you wanted to look back a little bit more on the job markets. We just posted this from the salary data. So it's great that the UXPA has done this for years. We dug back into that data to look at some of the historical comparisons to get some idea about how bad is it in UX. And so there, if you want to look into this a little bit more, you could see it's not just in UX, it was the entire tech industry contracted in 24, 23. So we have some additional data on that you can look into as well.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So I want to invite people, as we have about a little over 5 minutes left before we are scheduled to end the webinar. And if you haven't already, use the Q&A button in Zoom to post a question. This would be a great time to do it. I do see a couple of questions that I'd like to relay from an anonymous attendee seeking to, they ask, as an entry-level UX researcher job seeker, what would be your suggestions to optimize our profile for getting hired based on your strategy insights?
That's a good question. And so I can speak to that both as a hiring manager. So we obviously hire researchers at Measuring You for the past several decades. We're in our 20th year now. So both that and what the data is. So certainly the more of these facts, so you can't magically say you have all these years of experience, but certainly what you can do is do more of those skills that seem to differentiate. So when somebody is hiring, if we go back to, I think probably the best thing you can do is make sure you have some level of experience and demonstrated experience. This is what hiring managers want. Is there evidence when they're interviewing you that you can demonstrate that you understand what goes on in an in-depth interview? What's the difference between a survey? What's its role? What about usability testing? Can you speak to how the difference is between heuristics and how surveys are different than what about information architecture for research? And when it comes to design, I think making sure you're skilled up there is going to be probably the best thing that you can do to offset. Certainly the certification gets you some of that. It puts you into this. So taking those particular classes, that certainly sets you apart from somebody else who has no demonstrated experience that they know what they're getting into. When you're a hiring manager, probably it's something to keep in mind. Hiring managers want to reduce downside risk. They don't want to be in a situation where they hired somebody who has absolutely no idea what they're doing because they know, all right, I'm going to get in trouble because you're not. So they're looking for any clue that you're going to come into this job and make my life easier. So the more that you demonstrate that you know what you're doing, number one, and number two, especially when there's a new entrant in the field, you don't want people seeing like 5 months in or 3 months in, oh, this is not at all what I thought it was going to be. I didn't realize UX research wasn't, something else in psychology or academia. That's a risk for a hiring manager. So the more that you can show less risk in terms of, what's going on, what's in the job, you're making their job easier about hiring.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Another anonymous attendee, or perhaps the same one, asks, what suggestions do you have for a current UX master's degree student to get their first internship? I'm working full-time while pursuing my master's. And I will, point out that this probably is not the topic of your research or the survey, but since you both have been around the block for a while, maybe you can offer a little insight.
Well, I'll have to leave it more to Jeff. I got my internship by looking at the letters that were posted in the office in the psychology department at New Mexico State University, and there were 2 with IBM. Both of which I applied for and one of which I got. And then I spent 40 years at IBM. So I do not have lots of experience in that way.
Yeah, internships are a great way to show demonstrated experience. If you can't get it on the job that you're at, I mean, that'd be the first thing. I think what a real challenge is if you have a full-time job and then you need an internship, that can be challenging. There's a number of large organizations that have formal internship programs. It's been a bit of a double-edged sword over the last decade. There's been a bit of a backlash against unpaid internships because of sort of perceptions of exploitation, in which we understand. Unfortunately, it also meant there's just less of those. And so now those end up being essentially like paid jobs. And so it becomes harder to get those internships. But there are still opportunities to get those out there, unpaid internships. But even when they're unpaid, so imagine your situation where like, look, I just want to get that experience. Key thing is demonstrating that you're going to be able to do something and you're going to be a self-starter, because even if it doesn't cost money, the opportunity cost it takes for a manager to make sure you're doing something that's valuable to you, valuable to the organization, takes time. And so demonstrating that you can do that on your own, you could add value, and you can do something that the organization's looking at, whether it be a methodology or something that they've reported or a particular product area. That's the win-win. Certainly if you have a full-time job, harder, because you're gonna have to do that outside of business hours. But there's looking to nonprofits and so forth. There's a number of them out there. We'll do that. We work, for example, with a few organizations, nonprofit, that with the number of folks that are doing it later in their careers, whether it be on voting or education, just to help out. So they're out there if you look.
Great. All right. Well, let's wrap some things up here. And there is one final question that I'll get to here from Liam O'Brien. And this is probably outside of the survey itself, but still seems interesting. Liam asks, what's your take on senior practitioners leaving UX for related fields with more progression opportunities at higher levels, such as product?
That's interesting. I don't have a lot of sort of data to speak about that, but I can speak to, I think, the progression a little bit of certainly what you see is, if you're thinking of, as you progress in your career, and what we tell more junior folks, you certainly want to get experience. Have you done a large unmoderated benchmark? Have you done any kind of segmentation survey? How's your qualitative research? What kind of interviews have you done? Have you done any kind of contextual research? So first you want to go through and chip away at that. And then you can influence the product that you're working on. So we're at an agency, and so we help, or part of our company's agency, so we help clients, and so we help them influence the product, but we're pretty far removed from it. Then when you're in-house, you're closer to it and have that influence, but you're still on the periphery, if you will. You're still an advisor. So I could certainly see the place where you get to the point where, like, I've seen enough product mistakes, or I have enough idea about a product, I think I can generally steer that product direction. I think that's exciting. I think that's probably net good for all of us. The more people have a background in UX research, the more that they can influence the particular product or UX design. I think that's great. I don't know how easy or difficult that is. And I think a lot of that depends on people's particular interests, because when you own a product, it's not just all the interesting aspects of research. It's a lot of the nitty-gritty constraints that one has to deal with, profit and loss, and you get the long list of features. I always say it's one of the best ways to humble yourself as a UX researcher is go and try and build a product and realize all the requirements, all the constraints, the developer constraints. It gives you a good perspective on what it means to try and bring a product to market that is not only successful, but usable in some ways. It's hard. It's hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Jeff, for squeezing that in. And we're minutes past time for those of you who have stuck around. And indeed, for everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, this is our first webinar of 2025, and I think it was a great one. We host webinars every month as best we can, usually on Wednesdays. And we have some coming up, one scheduled for March, and one that we are working to put on the schedule for next month. So check out our website. Also a reminder that UXPA International hosts a annual conference every summer. This year it will be held in Amsterdam, Netherlands. You can check out our website for more information. Also, if you have an idea for a UX webinar or workshop, or if you have an interesting perspective, check out our website, and at the education link, you will find a form that you can submit your idea there. And with that, thank you very much, Jeff and Jim. Do you want to just briefly tell us how people can either keep in touch with you or follow your work?
Yeah, just go to measuringu.com. You can email, you can submit a question. They usually make it to Jim and I. So any of the sort of the questions, there's a lot of additional analysis that will be coming up, but feel free to reach out to us through the website, measuringu.com.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, well, that's a wrap. So thanks again, everyone. It was a pleasure hosting today's event, and hope to see you next time.
All right, thanks, Vijay. Take care.